Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Ahmed, and you're watching the first episode of the Institute for Language Acquisitions podcast. Today we're going to talk with a friend of mine named Shahin-ur Rahman, who is a learner of Arabic who also studies Islam and Islamic education. In this interview, we talk about his journey through Arabic and some of his tips and tricks of how to get through it and to attain a high level of mastery of Arabic. This episode is brought to you by Polylogger. Polylogger is a platform that I'm developing that allows users to log their language learning progress and meet other people who want to do the same. It's really a tool for encouragement, and I encourage you to check it out. You can use it at polylogger.com. All right, let's get into the interview. Hello everybody. Today I'm here with brother Shahin-ur Rahman. I've been following him on Twitter for some time, I think over a year now, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about Arabic language learning and Islam. And I thought it would be very beneficial for us to have a conversation with him about his learning process of Arabic, how he learned it, his suggestions for those who would like to learn. And so today we're going to have that conversation with him, and hopefully it benefits you. And if you have any questions for him, I'll make sure that I leave his Twitter handle in the subject or in the description so you can reach out to him. Let's get started and get to know our brother Shaheen just a little bit better. So would you mind giving us a short introduction about yourself?
Yes, once again, thank you for having me on this platform, Jazakallah khair. And in terms of myself, I'm a graduate of an Islamic seminary in Britain, and I'm currently a master's student in Islamic education as well at the University of Warwick.
Very nice. Thank you for that introduction. What's your history with the Arabic language? What drew you to learning it?
Well, I think those of us who grow up as Muslims, in our childhood, will always have this dream of, imagine knowing or Arabic one day, or imagine being able to speak it one day. And of course, back then, I didn't realize that Arabic was a spoken language, it's a living language. It just seemed like a far-fetched dream of some sort. But of course, when I was in my teens, my mid-teens, is when I started taking Islam a lot more seriously and wanted to look into the Quran in a more meaningful way. That's when I thought I'm going to need to learn Arabic, because it's the only way to access Islam in a more deeper way. So I think my motivations primarily are religious, of course, and any other interests of in the Middle East or the culture, things like that, they come secondary. So primarily for me, is religious motivations.
Very nice. And I know that you, in your interview with Sam, who has the Arabic with Sam YouTube channel and podcast, you were saying it was somewhere around 16, 17 where this kind of desire to begin really engaging with Arabic was strong.
Yeah, I think the desire was there when I was about 15, and
Mhm.
in terms of actually enrolling somewhere, that happened when I was 16 because I had to finish school. I was in my final year of school actually, and then once I was finishing, I applied to a Darul Uloom, to
Mhm.
an Islamic seminary in the UK. So as soon as I finished school at 16, then within a month or so, I went straight into Darul Uloom.
And your friend group at the time, were they also interested in learning Arabic, or was this something that was kind of more individual?
Interestingly, yeah, nobody was interested. I think there was one person actually, but that's mainly because I was talking about I'm going to go to a Darul Uloom. Does anybody wants to come with me?
Mhm.
And then I spoke to a friend who spoke to his father and said, okay, so we both went together actually. It's a very interesting journey, so we became really close friends after that. But in terms of actually learning Arabic, I think this was 2007, 2008, bear in mind, a long time ago now. So it wasn't a realistic pursuit for most of us. So I don't think people would seriously or would have considered it seriously just because
Mhm.
it wasn't a thing that people did, or there was no facilities, and it was nowhere near as common as it is today, mashallah. But so yeah, I don't think many people were as interested. So I think it was a sudden burst within me, and I
Mhm.
thought it's a passion that's driving me, and I'm going to need to go and do it because I don't care if other people aren't interested. I don't care if other people aren't, doing this. but I need answers and I have questions and I want to learn. I have a thirst to learn the language. I thought I'm gonna go and do it.
Very nice. Do you think today it would be easier for you to start that journey? You said that there wasn't really a lot of resources or institutions that allowed you to really grab onto Arabic, aside from the seminary that you attended. Do you think it's easier now for people to do that?
I think absolutely, yes. Within the last, 13 years, the world has changed considerably. So, the social media is a booming industry right now. We're living in a globalized world right now. There's a lot more resources, not only in terms of books and literature, but also in terms of accessing teachers. So one thing I didn't have when I was in 2007, 2008, there weren't any teachers for me. So I can't go somewhere locally, enroll in a place and learn Arabic because there weren't any such courses available and there weren't any teachers available. So that's why I had to go out of town. But nowadays you've got access to people online, people elsewhere. You've got people locally as well now. More and more people are coming about, and you've got you know basic familiarity with YouTube and other things, and so many people are teaching Arabic on YouTube, and you've got cartoons, you've got lectures, you've got durus, you've got conversations and podcasts. Podcasts just weren't heard of. They didn't even exist 13, 14 years ago. So I think, yes, if we were to fast forward in time and do everything now, then my experience would have been very different.
Definitely. I think you're totally right about the wealth of resources available now, not just learning material, but even native material that's available to us in the West. And if anybody who has an internet connection can get these native materials or learning materials, in seconds. But I guess the challenge now is kind of curating those resources in a way that's easy for learners to find them, not
Absolutely.
overwhelming them. So you mentioned that your journey with Arabic kind of started at the Dar al-Uloom, which is like a seminary for Muslims. Can you kind of explain to me how is Arabic teaching approached in the seminary? Are the four skills like reading, writing, speaking, and listening all focused on, or is it kind of exclusively about some skills and not others?
So I can't speak on behalf of all Darul Ulooms,
Hmm.
especially throughout the world, and even within the UK, the Darul Ulooms, differ quite a lot. They vary in their own, styles and their pedagogies and their approach and their vision. So I can only speak on behalf or confidently on behalf of the Darul Uloom that I went to,
Hmm.
and what happened there was an emphasis on. Well, the teacher who taught us Arabic, he did emphasize all four of them, but of course, we had many different teachers of Arabic, but the main one, I think, who taught us Arabic, he did focus on all of them. But of course, I think because our motivations are primarily religious,
Hmm.
that means we want to gain the ability to access and interpret religious scripture. So not only
Hmm.
the Quran and the Hadith, but also the literature throughout the last 14 centuries.
Hmm.
So I think reading naturally has, the top priority. Reading will always have the top priority, and I don't think that's going to be able to, no one's going to change that. So with reading comes writing anyway, because you won't be able to read a lot without having the ability to write, or without you won't be able to gain confidence in understanding and comprehension without practicing the rules and the vocabulary and everything else that you learn. So there is a there was some incentive towards writing in Arabic as well. So actually, when we used to have exams, the default in writing exams was in Urdu. So Urdu was another language that we had to learn. But some teachers, this is not all of them, some teachers used to give an extra mark if you write your paper in Arabic. So if you write your exam paper in Arabic, then you may just about get an extra mark depending on who the teacher is. So things like that were incentives, or for writing in Arabic as well. If somebody wants to write an article or somebody wants to do something else, that's completely up to them. Although it wasn't strictly mandatory per se.
Mm.
In terms of listening, not so much because it just wasn't really the norm there, and most of the people who study there aren't Arabs or children of Arabs. They're mainly a diaspora, um, Muslims from the subcontinent or who
Hmm.
originate from the subcontinent, and because of that, the Darul Uloom tradition goes back a couple of hundred years from the British era. And we have to realize that that wasn't a globalized world. They weren't engaging with everybody at the same time. So Arabic largely was treated like a dead language is today. So the way
Hmm.
people study Latin or the equivalent, Arabic was studied in that sense. It was more of an academic language rather than a living language. Whereas today, a lot of people go straight into immersion. They go straight into the Middle East, or they hire an Egyptian teacher on Skype or something. They go straight into immersion, which is a very different pedagogical style, you could say. So I think for us, because we come from the Darul Ulum tradition, we didn't have that.
Hmm.
Although our teacher did emphasize to us, when you go home, listen to some scholars, listen to durus, listen to khutbahs, and do these types of things. And obviously, in the Jumu'ah, khutbah would be in Arabic as well. So our teachers would basically deliver the khutbah in Arabic. So you get used to all of that. And once you're reading the books, all the books were read out in class in Arabic, of course,
Hmm.
even though the teacher lectured in Urdu. One teacher did actually sometimes just teach in Arabic. So when we were
Hmm.
studying Balagha, for example, Arabic rhetoric, and he would sometimes just teach the whole thing in Arabic. So some teachers did, through their own passion, just do that. But on the whole, I think listening and speaking is generally where the Darul Uloom tradition would lack, because it's not a priority. It's considered more of a bonus.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, like you said, the primary goal is to have you interacting with Islamic sources, the
Yeah,
Quran, the Hadith, and also just any other scholarship, which is across the
throughout
world.
history.
Muslim
Yeah.
scholarship is written overwhelmingly in Arabic, although you can find translations and other
Yeah.
works
I
in
I
other
think
languages.
one thing I forgot actually to mention is in our Darul Uloom, not only did we study classical Arabic, we also had to study modern standard Arabic as well. I personally don't like to differentiate between the two because
Hmm.
it's just an era, it's just a difference of an era, but the language structure, in my opinion, is the same. So Fusha is just one thing. So I consider Arabic as just Arabic. And sometimes you learn modern words or so-called modern words, but really you find these in classical books from like 1200 years ago.
Yes.
So and anyway, so we had to study, for example, GCSE Arabic,
Hmm.
and we had to do AS level and A2 level as well. So for those of you who are not in Britain, what that means is GCSE is basically the examination you usually do in schools at 16,
Hmm.
and A levels is what you do around the age of 18, which enables you to then go into universities. So obviously, I did my mainstream schooling in a state school, and afterwards, Darul Uloom is a private thing, which is not sanctioned by the government, you could say. Um, so there we did GCSE Urdu, GCSE Arabic as well, which is of course modern standard Arabic, and A level Arabic as well, again, which is modern standard. So we have had exposure to modern Arabic as well. So we had to study classical texts like Kalila wa Dimna and other things as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that idea that
Mhm.
well, that MSA and classical Arabic are more or less the same structurally. It's just a matter of really vocabulary. I mean, there's some grammatical things that you won't
Yeah,
find
but they
in
they
modern
changed
standard
throughout
Arabic.
history anyway. So
Hmm.
even if you look at, for example, Jahili Arabic from 1500 years ago, and you look at the Quran or Islamic Arabic, so pre-Islamic and post-Islamic Arabic, you will notice a difference.
Hmm.
And if you go a few centuries later, you will notice a difference. If you read literature from the scholars from Syria, for example, and compare them to the Persian scholars from Khorasan or from um, what's the word for it? Transoxiana and place in those types of places, their
Hmm.
language does differ. Their styles do differ. So naturally, Arabic will obviously evolve in that sense, but the language is still the same. But I think the point I was trying to get at actually was that in GCSE and in A level Arabic, you have to listen to things as well, and
Hmm.
you have to speak as well. So
Yeah.
you have an oral exam, and you have a listening exam, you have a reading exam, a writing exam, and things as well. So I think that's the advantage that we kind of had, where we have to practice all of that. So in those GCSE and A level lessons, I think that's where we got to listen a lot more. Although it's not the same amount of listening or immersion that we would get had we traveled to the Middle East, of course. But
Sure.
yeah, whatever you can get in a classroom setting, yeah, alhamdulillah, we did have exposure to listening as well.
Could you explain to somebody who wouldn't know really anything about the Madaris, like how exactly is Arabic learning? approached? Like, is it one subject Arabic? Are there many subjects? How does it work? How do people start learning?
So this is where it gets interesting, actually. So we don't have a subject called Arabic. That just doesn't exist. So I know nowadays people would, once a week learn Arabic or something. We didn't have that. We studied Mondays to Saturdays, and Saturdays being a half day. So Monday to Friday, we would have 9 lessons a day, and one of them would be on Urdu, one of them would be on Tajweed. Uh, so Tajweed, you could consider that part of Arabic, but I'm just going to exclude it for just for convenience sake. And the remaining 7 lessons were on Arabic, what we would call Arabic. So that
Okay.
would include like a lesson on Nahu, a lesson on Sarf, a lesson on literature, or a lesson on practicing what we'd call tamreen. So the rules and the grammatical rules you learn in Nahu and Sarf, they will be applied in in practical lessons as well. So
Okay.
so so we have around 7 lessons a day on Arabic, and on Saturdays, because there's 5 lessons, you'll probably do about 4 on Arabic, or yeah, 3 or 4 on Arabic, and one on Tajweed and one on something else.
So, what could you explain for someone who doesn't know the classical way that people study Arabic? What exactly the two primary science of Arabic, like Nahu and Sarf, are? What would be the easiest way to explain that to somebody?
I think if somebody is not familiar with Arabic as a language, then I think it will be pretty tough to explain
Okay.
purely because Arabic is very different from other languages. So I myself, for example, speak 4 languages, and all of those languages are very different. With except Bangla and Urdu, for example, quite similar. But English and Urdu and Bangla, you could say they're very different languages, but they are the same in terms of if you learn a word, then it's that word. It's not going to change in any way. Whereas Arabic is just very different. It has case endings. Of course, every language has case endings, but Arabic has case endings that show in the word itself. So in English, we can give an example in English, like saying "I went to the shop." If you say "I went to the shop," then you use the word "I" for me for the first person. Whereas if somebody says "he's talking to me," so the word I changes to me here because the case is different. So here we have an actual case of the word changing. Whereas if you use that in any other word, like you went to the shop or he's speaking to you, then the word remains the same. Or if I say something like this book, is sitting on my table, or I am reading the book, then the book is still the same. So in most languages, they stay exactly the way they are. But in Arabic, things would change. So if you say, هذا كتابي على طاولة, sorry, maybe not كتابي, you say, هذا كتاب, you would say كتاب, for example, or you would have a certain type of case ending. And if I were to say, أنا أقرأ كتابا, then the case ending will completely change and it will be visible. It'll be ostensible in the word itself. So I think those case endings, or studying those case endings and how they change depending on different rules and structures within the language, this is what we call nahw. So the purpose of nahw is to ascertain or to decipher which case ending would be read on a particular word, or would be spoken at the end of at the end of each word and every word throughout your sentence or throughout your paragraphs, and in order to avoid making a mistake, or in order to avoid errors in speaking and reading and of course interpreting somebody else's speech. So
Okay.
that's what nahw is. And
Okay.
sarf, sorry, yeah, sarf would be there's generally 2 things here. One is sarf and one is ishtiqaq, and they generally overlap. So we study sarf at the beginning, and then you do a bit of ishtiqaq later on as well. So what sarf really means is when you have root words. So Arabic is Semitic languages generally are root based. So the root words will expand into, or will morph into other words. So for example, let's just say the word thalj. I'm giving a modern example now. So thalj would mean ice or snow, depending on the context. And if you have a refrigerator, if you have a freezer and you want to freeze something, or you want to make something cold, you want to make your food cold, you call it a thallaja. So thallaja comes from the word thalj, which means ice. So thallaja would mean something that makes your food cold. So, but to give a more traditional or classical example, you'd have something like, again, kitab. So kataba. Anytime you hear the root kataba, It doesn't matter how you restructure it, it will always be related to the word writing. So if you say katib would be a writer. If you say maktub, it is something that's written, or like maktubat, or somebody's collection of writings. Kitab is a book, or it can be law as well, when something is written for you, ordained. So you can say, for example, kataba, kataba with a ha at the end, which mean authors or writers. And you have, for example, maktaba, which is a library, because in a library you go there and research, read, and write. You have maktab as well, which is an office in the modern context. So there's so many different words that you can have. So maktab actually, it means office, but linguistically it means a place of writing. So it's more thoughtful to mean it's a place where this verb happens. So the place where kataba happens or kitaba happens is in the maktab. So a maktab, because this is where you write, this is why it's called an office. So plenty of words like that. It's just rooted in the root words. So knowing about the root words and what differences they make when you change the pattern or change the scale, change the meter, you could say, this is what sarf is. So this is actually really, really important because the whole of Arabic language works like that. So in the Arabs actually say, النحو أم العلوم والصرف أبوها. So they say nahwa is the mother of all knowledge, and sarf is its father.
Very nice. I think it's a very apt, I guess, saying, because a lot of people think sometimes that language is an end to itself, but language can also be a key for many other things, right? It opens a lot of other avenues of knowledge. And that's why you study it in the madrasa, I guess, so you can access other ones. And that's why it's primary in the first 2 years, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first 2 years, or the first year at least, is very language centric. So you have to learn the language primarily. And then in the second year, well, at least in our place, in the second year, Arabic is still the primary content of what you're studying, but you also tap into immersion of other types of books. So whether it's Islamic legal books like fiqh texts, what we call Islamic jurisprudence, you have a bit of an exposure to that, and you start looking at Arabic grammar texts in Arabic now. So a Nahu book in Arabic, for example, and the fiqh books would be in Arabic, even though but sometimes those texts might be taught from the perspective of learning language, and sometimes they might be taught from the perspective of actually learning the legal theory now. And some teachers might combine the two, so teach you both, the legal side of it and the linguistic side of it as well. But after that, I think from third year onwards, your focus is more on the actual sciences and the actual subjects that you're studying, and language becomes secondary now. So although the language is a lot more advanced, but it takes a bit of a side role.
In your seminary, how was vocabulary? How was it taught, or how was it displayed? Because I know a lot of these books, like one of the best books for learning Nahu in Arabic is Nahu al-Wadih. And it's a very simple book of teaching, case endings and stuff like that. But it's very hard and inaccessible for someone who doesn't have a base vocabulary. So how did they give that to you in the beginning? Was it just word lists, or how was it approached?
Yeah, so remember I said at the beginning we had about 7 lessons on Arabic. So those lessons were doing different things. So one lesson you'd have on sarf, for example, so verb conjugations, and all these verbs you're going to have to memorize. So we had to memorize the whole table, fa'ala, 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 fa'alat, fa'alat, all the whole thing. And then you have to use so many other different verbs within the same table, and you'll have to get used to all of that and figure out which one means what. And you get a lot, you just have to practice that a lot. But in terms of normal vocabulary, like nouns and things, again, at the beginning, you just have to memorize them. So you'll have a lesson, you'll have a book, which I believe is a very underrated book. And in the English speaking world, I think they should benefit from it a lot more. It's been translated into English. It's called 10 Lessons. So 10 Lessons. It was original Urdu book, but very short text, very short text. But it takes you to, quite a comfortable level. So that book, what we would have to do is each lesson, although it's called 10 lessons, we did it in the space of about 3 months. So you could do it bite-sized. amounts at a time. So there's a whole list of vocabulary that you have to learn, and there's around one rule. There's one rule that you learn per lesson. So each of the 10 lessons is one rule per lesson. So you learn those vocabulary and you apply this rule with by combining those words into fitting into that type of sentence that uses this rule basically. So we would have to learn around 6 words a day. So we didn't have to learn the entire list of the whole lesson. So it would probably take a week or so. I'm not however long it was. Of course, it was a long time ago. So our teacher will force us. We have to memorize 6 words a day as homework, you could say, or whatever. But it has to be in order. So if you mess around the order, then then that's you'll be penalized for it or something. So we'd have to memorize father is ab plural aba, son is ibn plural abna, uncle from the paternal side is am plural a'mam, and uncle from the maternal side is khal plural akhwal. So we'll have to memorize that like memorizing a dictionary, and you'll get tested on that. So after you've done 6 words, 12 words, 18 words, later on you're gonna have to say the whole thing. So our teacher was quite strict in that respect, and I loved it because it strengthened our vocabulary to the point that even now there are certain things I know just because of that. So sometimes you can't even remember the English word just because I know the Urdu word because I've just memorized it like so many years ago. So like for example, nuhas, the word nuhas comes in there, which means lead. So I could just remember nuhas beetle because I just memorized the two things together in 2008, and it's just stuck in my head. So yeah, I think we had a lot of memorization, which is I know a lot of people take issue with that because memorization versus understanding is a lot more important than things, which is, I think that is an important debate to be had, which is true, and I agree with that. But in terms of learning languages, I don't think you can get away from learning vocabulary. Sure, you might be able to make it easier somehow by, I don't know, using flashcards or attaching it to an image or something. There are other ways to do it. But I don't think adults would be too keen on using flashcards or children's style, have a skeleton on the head, right? Ras, and on the foot, right? Qadam or something like that. I think adults tend to feel a bit infantilized through this. So I think they just prepare to learn something intellectually rather than something else. Of course, I'm generalizing here. That's not always going to be the case. But yeah, I think in terms of vocabulary, we had to memorize a lot of these vocabs, and then we had to use it in these exercises. And once we've done those 10 lessons, then we move on to a proper children's book. We used Qisas al-Nabiyyin by Sheikh Abdul Hasan Ali al-Nadwi, rahimahullah. Very famous text, and studied all around the world. But this is our first Arabic book that we study. And we look at that not from the perspective of stories of the prophets. We look at it from the perspective of language. So what we'd have to do there is here you'll have even more exposure to new words and new vocabulary and things now. So what we'd have to do is we'll have an exercise book. I'll just show an exercise book. So what we do is we'll open up the back and we'll draw some lines on the you can say like a few centimeters for the margin and a few centimeters on the end and have a longer section in the middle. And what you would do is on the first bar, you can say on the first column, you write the new word that comes, let's just say qalam. Everybody's going to know qalam anyway, but let's just say qalam. So you write qalam in there, and then in the middle, you'll include all the meanings that you find. So generally it's going to pick 10, but there might be other things as well if you look into a more complicated word. And then you'll have the plural and as many plurals that appear, you have to write all of them down. Or if it's a verb, for example, like kataba, then write kataba there and which verb it's from. So those who study Arabic from the Western perspective, they tend to learn forms like form 2 and form 4, form 7. We don't have a clue what form 2 and form 7 things are. So we learn verb nasara yansuru. This is verb daraba yadribu, for example. This is verb taf'il. This is verb if'al, verb infi'al. So we just learn the actual meter of it. So we write those down, and then all the masadir that it comes on, you'll write all of those things down as well. So you have to learn the vocabulary, you have to learn the translations, you have to learn everything that's around it as well. So I guess an example could be something like feel. Feel means elephant, And plural, there's not only one plural there. You'll have afiyal as well. You can have fiyala as well, or there are different plurals. So you write all of them down, and all these combinations you're going to have to learn them. And sometimes, of course, verbs can change. The meanings of verbs can change depending on their contexts and depending on the harf jar that comes with it, the preposition that comes with it. So, for example, if you have hadatha, hadatha can mean something happening, occurring, or hadutha can mean something new, or haddatha could be to speak. So they're very different now. So if you have haddatha, this is from taf'il, which would be form 2 in the Orientalist method, and you'll have to write. It is, isn't it? It's the Orientalist method. I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. I'm just saying the traditional method versus a newer method. So we would say tahdith, for example, حدث يحدث تحديثا فهو محدث, and you write those down. So حدث, somebody, it could mean to speak, or it could also mean to narrate a hadith if you're going to speak in a more hadith kind of context. So you write all of those down. Or if it's something like muhdath, what does muhdath mean? So muhdath can mean something new. It can mean a form of heresy in a theological sense. It can mean an invention. There's various different meanings for it. So or ihdath, it can also mean somebody who goes to the bathroom or breaks wind and thereby breaks their wudu. So wudu is obviously a Shari'i concept that Muslims would be familiar with. And when invalidating the wudu through, some sort of impurity, whether it's going to the bathroom or otherwise, this would be called a hadath as well. This is called a hadath. So these types of work, all these combinations that come from the same root, you have to write all of them down. And your teacher at any time might just stop you and say, what does this mean? And how many meanings does it have? What are its plurals? What are its masadir? Like sometimes you can have something from nasara yansuru and daraba yadribu as well. And your teacher would ask you, how do you read this word? Or like, for example, hasiba. You can say hasiba yahsabu, or you can say hasiba yahsibu as well. And sometimes people would guess it, but sometimes people would learn it as well. And your teacher's job is to tell you, to check whether you've learned it properly or not. So I think this is basically how we learn vocabulary. I think it's a rigorous and stronger method, although it could be very overwhelming at the beginning and put a lot of people off. But I think once you crack through that surface, it's very, very effective. Definitely very effective.
How often would you go about reviewing those lists? Did you have any kind of methodology for yourself or anything your teachers recommended?
I think the way Darul Ulum's work is of course very different from school and university. So what happens in Darul Ulum is you'll have your lessons in the daytime from 8 o'clock until 4 o'clock. But in the evenings from about 7:30 till half past 5 till 7:30, and you will be put into groups of 3 or 4, depending on how many people in your class. And everybody would be in a huge hall with a couple of benches and in groups, and they'll revise the entire day's lesson. And so there you'll have to revise everything, and if somebody's stuck, then you help each other out, and you just clarify things. And if there's a teacher supervising everything, you go to him for questions and things as well. So that's the main thing. But of course, you're expected to, outside of class time and outside of your formal study time, you're expected to learn during those times, because in the Islamic tradition, learning doesn't just happen. It's not a passive thing. That's yes, you sit at the feet of your teachers and you learn from your teachers, but you aren't taught there and you just leave it there. You have to have a talab, or a self-driven motivation. So talabul ilm is a very famous Islamic phrase. Sometimes we'll say Arabic, but it's actually an Islamic concept. So the self-driven nature of it would mean that outside of class time, the student has to spend his own time or her own time learning, whether their vocabulary or practicing the rules that they've learned and other such things. So yeah, I think the teachers encourage that a lot, and they say, what kind of students are you if you don't have a self-driven passion to go and learn yourself? Because so I think that's a really important concept to bear in mind as well. So yes, in the classes, if somebody focuses in class, then that would be more than enough practice for to get by on. And in what we call takrar in the evenings, I think that is really, really useful. And it also serves as teacher training, which is I think is a separate discussion. But you revise everything you learn there. So that gives you, the spaced repetition, you could say. Takrar actually means repetition, doesn't it? So karrara yukadiru, takriran and takraran. So takrar means repetition. So that's the point of it. You revise, revisit, and repeat it. And outside of that, so before your classes or in the lunch break and things like that, if you can go through and memorize your words and learn them and practice them, think of examples and things, then it definitely helps. And of course, after you've done all of that, then you move on to other things, and it just accumulates from there.
And so I presume that you keep up that practice of noting down vocabulary throughout your time in the seminary, but it becomes more of a way for you to just supplement your reading. As you're reading something and you come across a word you don't know, you kind of just add it to the list. Or
Yeah.
is this list thing more of something you do in the first 2 years?
In the first 2 years, I think you have to do it. In the second 2 years, you have to do it for a couple of lessons. So the adab lessons, the lessons on literature, you have to do it there. You don't need to do it on something like fiqh or tafsir or something like that. Because of course, when you're learning the Quran and you're learning to translate the Quran, you will write down those new words anyway. But you're not going to do the full, what are its plurals, what kind of abwab does it come in, or what kind of different meanings could it possibly have, depending on which harf jar you use. You're not expected to do all of that except in the lessons of adab. And then, so after fourth year, so in the fifth and sixth, we went to an institute that it's a 6-year course. So in the fifth and sixth year, you don't have to do it, apart from just making notes of the hard words anyway, which you would naturally do, and you will be examined. You won't be examined on this particular word. What kind of meanings does it have? You'll have a hadith, for example, and you'll have to be able to translate the hadith and explain what it means and talk about the different discussions surrounding the hadith, for example. So if you don't know the vocabulary, or then obviously you'll struggle in translating and explaining what it means, for example.
Definitely. So this is all very interesting. I've never really had an in-depth view of how this works in seminaries. Or I mean, I know you said it's more particular to yours, and maybe other seminaries approach it differently.
Yeah, most of them will follow the same structures. I think the difference would be in whatever difference each teacher brings, and whatever differences that each textbook brings. So if people use different curriculum texts, that's it. They're the only differences you're really going to find. Other than that, the methodology is generally the same. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be much of a Darul Ulum anymore. It will be a different type of learning institute, which is not a problem, of course. But the Darul Ulum tradition has a very specific and successful, methodology.
And you being an instructor now, and having gone through that process at the seminary, is there anything that you think could change that might be more beneficial, or do you think the structure of how people learn is in line with the goals, and so there's no reason to really change it?
I think that's a hard question, because the moment you change something, it has other repercussions. And so while there definitely are, improvements you can make, but then you'll have to sacrifice something else as well. So for example, I'll give an example. Is we weren't allowed to have phones and tablets and things in our institute. Yeah, as in you can take it there and hand it in, but that's fine. But you can't, you don't have any access to it throughout your, the time you're there.
Sure.
So if you want to introduce something like, okay, you have a tablet, have your phone, and look at things, read different articles on the internet and things. If you want to introduce all of that, then that means you're going to have to permit having tablets and phones in a boarding institute. And that will have other repercussions. Of course, you're going to waste a lot of time. You're going to get very distracted. You might want to sit there for half an hour studying, but every 30 seconds you're looking at your Twitter to see what's going on. Do you get me? So
Yeah.
it would have that consequence. So I think that's something each institute would probably have to consider for themselves. But of course, if we're speaking strictly theoretically, I think there are, of course, different options now. So you can go within a Darul Ulum context and study, and you can study outside of that context as well, generally within local masjids or Arabic institutes or just online classes and things. So there, outside of the Darul Ulum context, where Actually, when you have private teachers and things, one of my teachers lives up north as well, an Arab teacher there. So he teaches in a very different way. So what happens is, you can have your phone, you can have your iPad with you, and there will be a screen in class as well. And the sheikh might even play a cartoon for you to watch and listen to, or he might give a BBC interview, a BBC Arabic interview, and you have to listen to it and write down, what's going on, and demonstrate that you can understand what's going on, for example. So people can have different things. So it depends where I were to teach. If I were to teach in a masjid, for example, then there may be some things that are inappropriate for the masjid. So I probably wouldn't, use those types of techniques in there. If I were teaching outside of a masjid context where you don't have you know, it's not a place that can be blasphemed in any way, then, you might do different things. Like, you might read a passage from Harry Potter, you might read a passage from, various different literatures. You might look at some type of poetry that might be in like, if you look at Jahili poetry, for example, a lot of those things are, neutral. You can read them anywhere. But there are some things that I would avoid reading in a masjid. So
Yeah,
if
definitely.
if they're talking about alcohol, if they're talking about women and describing women and things, I might not feel too comfortable to teach those types of poetry in the masjid. But it would be okay in a different setting for the sake of the language and for the sake of noting the contexts of certain usages in Jahili poetry, for example. So I think things like that will affect what kind of decisions you make. So if you were to suggest something like, or looking at cartoons, or listening to the Imam of Haram delivering khutbah, or something like that, that might not go down well with everybody. For example, we have there is a strong fiqhi opinion among a lot of the scholars today, very respectable one and valid opinion, who say photography and videography are haram. So those who believe photography and videography to be haram and impermissible, you wouldn't suggest to them to include cartoons in their lessons, for example. That would be highly inappropriate and something that would be considered disrespectful to even suggest. So in those kind of contexts, we wouldn't do that, and you wouldn't really change too much, apart from maybe curriculums and books and things. So we use, for example, not only Islamic texts, but we also used GCSE Arabic, which is a school textbook. So there you look at, going to the zoo, looking at giraffes, watching TV. So you learn things about how do you say switch on the TV in Arabic. You see all of these contexts because you're studying it. But of course, in an Islamic book that's from 300 years ago, you're not going to find that. You will find it today. You'll find about smoking, but you
Yeah.
get to learn these modern contexts like tadkhin. And tadkhin comes from what dukhan. Dukhan is in the Quran, and the word dukhan obviously means smoke, and smoke is just a normal word that you're going to find everywhere. But smoking as a verb, tadkhin, is a modern, there's a modern context now. But I think we have to be familiar with these things. But in terms of teaching and adopting modern teaching styles, it will completely depend on adapting it within your own values and principles. So if somebody disagrees with photography and videography, I think that should be respected as well.
Okay, that makes sense. I can appreciate that answer. It sounds a little bit like you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you'd like to see maybe a little bit more technology used in the classroom, not necessarily video and photos,
Yeah,
but
I think not necessarily in the classroom per se, but I think we should definitely take advantage of it outside of the classroom. So in the classroom, you probably won't have, for example, I was thinking to restart teaching Arabic again, and one thing I was thinking is I, I would only teach like once a week or twice or once in 2 weeks, but I'll make the students do something every day. So I wouldn't waste their time coming to class and play a cartoon. I'll teach them something, and every day of the week I'll send them a cartoon and say, watch this and make note of the vocabulary and styles that you learn. Because if you want to watch a cartoon, why should I waste someone's time making to come to class and do it? Whereas that's something you can do by yourself. And it's the Morabbi's job, it's the job of the educator to help these students grow and enable them to, or at least encourage them to become self motivated learners. So giving them these facilities and enabling or making it easy for them I think that's what my job is to do. So we'll try to teach them what you need a teacher for, and we'll give them guidance for to make things easier for them. So when they try to explore different things, you don't want to waste time looking, searching for 2 months when I could have just told you that, like, a couple of weeks ago. So things like that, I think cartoons and watching videos and things, I, I might not include it within the classroom unless
Hmm.
unless it's an activity that we're doing together. For
Sure.
example, like in GCSE Arabic, you'll have to listen to something and the teacher will test you, can you understand it? If I
Hmm.
write it down, you'll definitely understand it. But if you hear it, like, غادرت الطائرة, can you hear that and listen to it and understand it? Whereas
Hmm.
if you see it written down, because there is a stage, I remember there was a stage where if you hear something, you can't quite catch it. But if you see it written in front of you, then you can understand it, like, really quickly. So I think those types of exercises, yes, we would include in the classroom. But I
Hmm.
think those things that you don't really need a classroom for, and things can be done outside, then I think we should do that as well. Just like in universities, when reading a paper, reading an academic paper, they tell you read that in your own time, and we come to class and discuss the paper. We're not
Hmm.
going to the lecturers won't waste our time by reading through the whole paper in class. Because we can read English, we can download these PDFs from our repositories,
Hmm.
and you're expected to read all of those. Those who read it will read it. Those who don't read it won't read it. And then when you come into the seminar, the discussion will take place around it. Those who didn't read it will struggle, and those who did read it can engage in the classroom a lot better. So I think those types of techniques are probably what I would introduce or include.
Very nice. I like those ideas. And I'll be looking out to see any announcements about your Arabic classes for
It,
friends that I
it,
have that are interested.
I don't actually plan to do an international one.
Mm.
I was hoping to remember I said at the beginning of the of this interview that in my own town people weren't really too interested in it.
Hmm.
So that I feel that's still largely the case now. There are small amounts of interest, but what I would want to do is try to get my local people to learn. And
Hmm.
so I would want to tailor something specific to them because I did try it in 2015, sorry, 2014. So I did it for a whole year, 2014 to 2015, and it wasn't really too, you don't really have that much of an interest. A lot of
Hmm.
people would say, yes, I'm interested, yes, I'll be interested, but then they just don't come. Yeah. So now I'm thinking, okay, 5 years later, let's retry it again. So I'm thinking if I do something, it'll be only for my local community first,
Hmm.
and maybe we might be able to extend that outside. It just completely depends.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking Corona mindset in the age of
Yeah,
Zoom,
yeah,
like everything is international.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know.
No, it is of course. So I do other things like recently I delivered I delivered a webinar on Arabic poetic meters. So
Hmm.
علم العروض in what we call in Arabic. So I delivered something like that internationally for the public because this was during lockdown. It was on Zoom. It was available for everybody, and it's available on YouTube now as well. So those types of things, yeah, you can definitely look out for. And but they'll generally be one-offs. They won't really be long-term courses. If I do a long-term course, I'm going to try to prioritize my local community first. If they're not too interested, then maybe do something else.
Very nice. I think it's a noble goal. I think sometimes people have
Yeah.
this very broad goal. They want to change the world, but they kind of ignore more local problems in their
Yeah.
communities and stuff like that. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I like that idea. Um, Pretty recently, you posted a tweet encouraging others to learn Arabic, and I think you do that kind of, I wouldn't say frequently, but it's a common theme in on your Twitter account. So
Mm.
is there why do you encourage people to learn Arabic? Is it just for Muslims, or do you think it's for everyone?
I think that's an interesting question actually, and I'm glad you picked up on it. That I do that quite frequently or often enough. I encourage Arabic, but just the other night was a really strange one, where I was just before I go to bed. I thought, let me just tweet something about Arabic,
Hmm.
and then I woke up, in the middle of the night to get my daughter some milk or something, or Fajr time, or whenever I looked at my phone later, I found it's got quite popular, even though it's in the middle of the night. And,
Yeah.
and then in the daytime, it was like so many. It's on like over 1,000 likes and things. So I'm thinking, what's happening here? It was just a random tweet just before bed. But yeah, so I do these things quite often, and for
Hmm.
some reason, this one just went out there. Quite, I have no idea why that happened. So it's because of that, I think you messaged me, say, okay, come on to the interview.
Mhm.
So yeah, the reason I do that is I think there are a number of reasons why we need to learn Arabic, right? So for Muslims, I think that's a given. I think we don't need to explain why we need to learn Arabic, right?
Sure.
But there are other things as well, like not just religious and liturgical reasons and scholarship reasons, but I'm talking about normal Muslims, normal lay Muslims as well, who don't intend to become scholars. I think it's important to have at least have access to learning Arabic. So one thing is Arabic is the only language that can unite the Muslims across the globe. And I'm not talking about theological unity or anything
Mhm.
like that. I'm talking about if you go to Russia or somewhere and meet a Russian Muslim, yeah,
Mhm.
and let's just say they don't speak English and I don't speak Russian, but we're Muslims and we have the same, theology and we have the same, there'll be aspects of our culture that might overlap. There'll be aspects of, various other things we might want to talk to and learn from each other, but we
Mhm.
can't communicate. And I think that's a bit bizarre that we can't communicate because not everybody speaks English, contrary to what we Westerners might think. We think the whole world speaks English, but that's just our Eurocentrism coming through. But I think when you meet elders in the community, like our Somali elders, or obviously I'm from a Bangladeshi background, so if I meet a Somali elder, if I meet an Arab elder and an Albanian elder, we have find so many types of people in our communities. But if without Arabic, it's hard to communicate with them. So I think it's important. And one of my teachers, a sheikh who I studied some Arabic with after my Darul Ulum studies, he actually says that he believes we can make Arabic the second language of Muslims in Europe
Mhm.
in just 2 generations. So that's all it would take. So my generation, if we start teaching our children Arabic now, by the time they grow up in 20 years, and they all teach it to their children and their students and whatever, that's it. It'll take 40 years, so just 2 generations, and we can cause this revival and make Arabic the universal second language of Muslims in Europe. It can
Mhm.
quite easily happen, especially when there's there's of course a lot of different Muslims are from every background. You have diaspora Muslims like myself, and you have others who are native to Britain, native to America, and they converted to Islam. And of course, English would be their native tongue anyway. But so for them it'll be a second language, and
Mhm.
for us, I think it'll be like a third or fourth language. But for our children, English will basically be their first and only language, maybe. But I'm thinking if we can teach them Arabic, then yes, okay, they might distance themselves from the various other contexts, which doesn't need to happen because culturally they might be attached to those kind of, they might still have some kind of attachment there. But I
Mhm.
think more importantly is how to be a Muslim in the modern context. So you need to be familiar with the tradition or be able to access it. And in a globalized world, we need to know Arabic to communicate with the rest of the world as well. And those of us who go into academia as well, one problem we find in academia within the Islamic study circles or Islamic something circles, Islamic education circles, is they don't explore Arabic literature or Arabic studies. So you look at what Rosenthal has to say, you look at what this person has to say, and you look at general Western academic literature from the 70s onwards. But the Arab world are publishing academic papers too. They are publishing academic books too. Indonesia is doing it. Iran is doing it. So many countries. Turkey is doing it. There are so many journals. Of course, they're going to be different in the ranking, whatever the case. But
Mhm.
I think they need recognition within the Western academy as well. And okay, it makes sense for unilingual or monolingual researchers to do that. You're going to restrict yourself to whatever language you know. And but I think for Muslims, we need to be able to bridge the gap and show that no, Muslims are worldwide. They are in a global context, and if we're going to have an academic discussion about something related to Islam or Muslims, then I think it's fair to include Muslims of different cultures and backgrounds and countries, especially if they're within your discipline. So, for
Mhm.
example, if I let's say someone like yourself would be looking at linguistics, and you think, okay, let's look at what British and American thinkers have to say about linguistics. There might be some kind of methodological flaws here. That what if those researchers are only monolingual? What if they've only looked at French and Spanish and Italian, but they've not looked at Arabic?
Hmm.
Why don't we look at what Arab linguists have to say? Isn't that something that we might be
Yeah.
interested in? So things like that. I think there's a lot of reasons to learn Arabic, and of course raising the literacy levels as well. So a lot of us who some of our parents and grandparents and things, they probably wouldn't know their date of birth or something. I remember when I was 10, the last time I went to Bangladesh was 2002, and I remember asking some neighbors, when were you born? Do you know when you were born? And they were like, oh, they say things like, oh, we have this written. It's written on our walls. And I used to laugh at them. What, you don't know when you were born, and then or it's written down. Like, how do you know it's written down? What if these records are just made up or something? So I used to make fun of them like that. But now that I'm older, you think, hold on a minute, how many of us know our Hijri date of birth, for example, or how many of us are familiar with the Arabic months? Yeah.
Sure.
So that's important for religious reasons. Like, when do you celebrate Ramadan?
Hmm.
When do you go to Hajj? Do you just look for announcements on WhatsApp and Twitter when everybody do you do that, or is there something behind that as well? And so those people who start off those messages, how do they
Hmm.
figure it out? So it's quite important for us to know these things.
I
I
thought
think
everybody just Googled it. When is Eid 2020?
I think a
Make it the
lot of people would
Gregorian.
do. A lot of people
Gregorian.
would do, but why do we have to?
Exactly.
I think that's the question. Why
Hmm.
should we have to? Especially now, when Arabic for most of us is not just a theoretical language anymore. So
Hmm.
in a global context, you've got various Arabs within the countries that we live in. You've got access to what's going on in the Haramain, what's going on in the various parts of the world, and you've got newspapers, you've got journals, you've got poetry, you've got literature, you've got everything that's coming out in the Arab world, and people in the Western world we're familiar with it. So for us, it's a living tradition as well, not just a theoretical academic one. So I think in terms of listening, watching, speaking, texting, emailing, I think all of those things are really, really important. Like sometimes we might, we really want to purchase a certain book, but we can't find it anywhere in Britain. And so you have to go on Jamalon or Nil Wafarat or something in Lebanon or Jordan or Egypt or Saudi or somewhere like that. And then obviously when they email you, it's going to be in Arabic. So this
Hmm.
Arabic won't be the Quran or Sunnah type of Arabic. They'll be very modern words. So if you
Hmm.
can't respond to an email, you're going to struggle with purchasing things from abroad. And in the modern context where our social dealings or our monetary dealings are quite international now, I think for Muslims we do need to be familiar with Arabic as well, and for non-Muslims as well. I think for non-Muslims I can't really comment too much, but
Hmm.
uh, you know they would have different reasons for studying Arabic. So I appreciate it's not for everybody, and some people have sinister agendas as well. There is actually a prominent politician within England. I don't need to say who he is. His son was actually studying Arabic in SOAS in the University of London. So you might think, hold on, why are people like that learning Arabic for? Yeah, is it going to be a problem? Is it not going to be a problem? But of course, as in for it's lucrative for many non-Muslims to learn Arabic because of the economy in the Middle East. So people
Hmm.
go there for work. People go there for untaxed jobs, so you can get jobs there that don't tax you, and then you can come back to India and buy a house or something. So a lot of people do those types of things.
Yeah.
But of course, I don't, I would think that's a bit of a trivial reason to learn an entire language.
Yeah.
Uh,
Definitely.
but a lot of other people would probably be interested in the cinema. So in the Arab cinema, the cartoons and things obviously for children, but the film industry or the drama industry, I don't think is boomed as much as Turkish and Pakistani and other places have.
Not by a
Uh,
long, not by a
not
long
by a
shot.
long while. Yeah, but in terms of cartoons, I think they've done really well. In
Hmm.
terms of cartoons, they've done really well. But I think if somebody were to learn these for these reasons, then that's up to them. It's not something I would encourage. I would say if you're going to learn Arabic, you can learn it to appreciate the culture, to appreciate the poetry, to appreciate literature in there. Or what I would personally say is, you can learn the language, explore the Quran, see the beauty of Islam, and become Muslim, inshallah. So
Inshallah.
if any non-Muslims are watching this video right now, then please, I invite you formally, please explore religion, explore Quran, explore Islam, and if you have any questions, then message us, inshallah, and we'll be happy to cater for you, inshallah.
Being in the UK and kind of, you said you had a little bit of experience conducting Arabic classes. I assume most of your students might be from the diaspora, but are primarily Anglophones.
Yeah.
What would you say are some problems or some difficulties that Anglophones have with approaching Arabic?
I think the biggest problem we probably have, well, there's not actually a biggest problem. There's a number of problems we have. One is that there's no tailored curriculum for Anglophones to learn Arabic. So even something like GCSE Arabic, for example, where you're going to school to learn Arabic and to get a certificate, that's not actually aimed at Anglophones. That's aimed at Arabs who are living in the Western world. So they would already know some sort of Arabic and they'll have to develop and build on from there. So you'll have to have some kind of rudimentary knowledge of Arabic to begin with in the first place. So so even those books that we get from Chicago or elsewhere, they are actually targeted at diaspora Arabs. And when it comes to to curriculum texts from the Arab world, whether it's from Saudi or Egypt or somewhere else, or Syria or somewhere, Iraq, they obviously they are targeted at Arabs learning Arabic. So people say, "Oh, look at Al-Arabiya Bayna Yadayk." That's the best text out there. Yes, it will be one of the best texts out there for their own context. Or a lot of people look at the Medina books, or they call it the Medina books, Durus al-Lughat al-Arabiyya. But those books are taught at Medina University in a classroom setting, in an international classroom setting for non-Arabs who have come to Medina to learn Arabic, going to the shops and buy, some, I don't know, vegetables and things. So, you'll have things like, oh, where are you from? I'm from Japan. Where are you from? I'm from Bangladesh. Where are you from? I'm from, Britain. Those types of conversations are happening, and you have notepad and, classroom type of vocabulary, which is brilliant for its own context. It doesn't really fit. It's not really fit for purpose for those of us learning Arabic for a different reason, or for a different short-term reason and long-term reason within the UK or the USA or something like that. So I think that's probably one of the issues. I think another issue is the content in a lot of those books, again, are either too theoretical. Like if you look at a grammar text, it'd be so theoretical that it doesn't have enough practice there, or you'll have something that's it is full of writing and sentences and examples of things, but they're of irrelevant topics, like going to the zoo and looking at a giraffe. If somebody's thinking, like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, of course. I'm saying that's important. That's good to know to have a wide understanding of the literature in general. But I don't think it's the first thing that people need to know. So if somebody's looking for religious text, or they have a religious motivation, or they just want to access history, for example, or they want to access whatever, I can't think of many contexts where learning about giraffes and animals it will be should be the first thing that you learn. So it's like when you learn English or in schools, they have A for apple, B for ball, C for cat and things, and you go to like X and says Z for X for xylophone. Like, when do you ever need to know what a xylophone is? Yeah, or Y for yacht. Like, who even which child even knows how to pronounce yacht, and why do they need to know what it is? And which privileged person made this alphabet and thought Y for yacht? That you couldn't think of any other words that a child might actually access in the real world with the Y. Look, I'm in my late 20s now, and I've never seen a yacht in my life. Yeah, so I think those kind of pedagogical issues, I think we have as well in our textbooks. So like, what is the purpose of this textbook, and what stage should somebody reach by the end of it, and do these lessons pave the path to reach that goal. So I think things like that as well. But I think more importantly, I think there's a lack of competent teachers. By that, I don't mean I'm not criticizing teachers. I don't mean to say that teachers are incompetent. That's not what I mean here. Teachers, mashallah, are brilliantly competent. I'm talking about our localities don't have enough facilities or they don't have teachers. So a scarcity of teachers who can teach you Arabic. So, when I was 15, there was nobody here to teach me Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm sure, yes, there are a lot more things available now, but it's still not in every locality. Muslims are everywhere, and
Mm-hmm.
people who want to learn Arabic are everywhere. Like when I tweeted that the other night, please learn Arabic. People were saying, "How can I learn Arabic?" Or say, "Oh, I really want to, but I can't. Can you teach me?" Like, well,
Mm-hmm.
like I don't even know who they are, but they're asking me to teach them. Like I don't mind teaching them, but it tells you that there isn't much of an avenue or a facility for a lot of people to learn Arabic even now. So that's what I mean by I think there is a lack of teachers who will be able to teach you. And of course, that's one thing. And another thing would be that those who do teach aren't necessarily, trained in teaching. So teacher training and being familiar with education theory, I think that's something as well. So when I was teaching Arabic in 2014, 2015, I was just teaching Arabic as somebody who's studied Arabic and who can teach, the Medina books. But
Mm-hmm.
now that I'm at university, and well, now that I've had quite a few more years after graduating, I've experienced various different things, and I'm at university studying education. So we're studying education philosophy, education theory, educational psychology of education, various things, in like modern theory as well as from the Turath. That would inform my practice now if I were to teach Arabic now. So those some teachings that I have done, whether publicly or privately, I have tried to implement um, you know those teachings within my practice now. So how to do that in Arabic is something I would want to experiment, which is why I wouldn't want to teach Arabic internationally straight away. I'd want to try out with my local people first,
Mm-hmm.
experiment and see if it works or it doesn't work. If it works, then of course we can, make it mainstream. If it doesn't work, then we could try it with another bunch, change something else, and do things like that. But I think we need to implement modern education theory as well as linguistic theory and people's real life experiences. Because, of course, as somebody who grew up bilingually and studied two Arabics within my teens,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, two languages within my teens, I have a personal experience in learning Arabic. So when it comes to linguistic theory, there's some things that we will take with a pinch of salt, and there are other things I think, yeah, this actually resonates with my own experiences as well. So I think to bridge the gap between the theory and practice is something that's really important as well. So when those teachers who do that, then and they of course there's a handful of them available. I think they do quite a successful job when it comes to teaching Arabic.
Very nice. And so one of the difficulties you focused on was a lack of a curriculum, really for Anglophones,
Yeah,
and
tailored lack of tailored curriculum.
mhm,
Yeah,
sure. And I know in your podcast a couple years ago with Sam, you talked about a series that you were developing called Safar, which is aimed at teaching Arabic for all levels, really, but starting from young ages and continuing forward. What's the progress on that? Like, how is that going currently?
okay, so Safra Publications is actually an interlinked curriculum series. So
Hmm.
it's not just Arabic there. We have Learn About Islam series. We have a Learn to Read series where you
Hmm.
learn the Arabic alphabet, learn tajweed, learn how to recite the Quran. We have Learn by Heart series, which is du'as and supplications and things which will be useful for Muslims to memorize. We have those series as well, and a fourth series we have is Learn Arabic series. So
Hmm.
the Learn Arabic series, this is the one where I said a couple of years ago I was a project manager of that project. But we had a lot of back and forth on that, and quite a lot of things happened. And because of other urgencies in other departments and things, and my own context changed in that I had a child and I went to university and those things, so my work ended up part time. So I eventually had to pull out of that field. So that progress is happening slowly,
Hmm.
but I think we are slowly reviving that as well. So it's not happening just yet, as in it's still in the making.
Sure.
We did have quite a lot of discussion about how to go about it, and we did produce some lessons as well,
Hmm.
and to try out with the children. And because in Safar Academy, Safar Academy has 5 branches, and Safar Publications is a wing of Safar Academy. So the lessons that we produce in the publications, are tried and tested within the academy.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those lessons were tried within London, within a British context of diaspora Muslims. Can you teach Arabic effectively to like 7-year-olds, for example, in a way that embeds, tarbiyah in there? Uh, there's spiritual development in there. There's akhlaq and character-driven content, rather than say going to a zoo and looking at giraffes. Um, Primarily, I don't think that's what 7-year-olds in the Western world want to learn about. They would want to learn about the masjid, the Quran, or Ramadan. Those words are Arabic already, so they know
Mm-hmm.
these words already. So using those kind of things that they're familiar with, and then build on that, for example, and talking about family life, talking about relationship with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, those types of things. I think having that kind of a curriculum that teaches children in the Western world Arabic in a way that's meaningful and tailored to them. And once that develops further and further, then of course it widens out uh, in its input.
And would you say one of the primary goals when you were first in talks about this series, Safar, one of the primary goals was to really address the idea that there's no tailored curriculum for Anglophones, or was it even, did you have that in mind at the time?
I think that's exactly what it is. So when we look at other existing curriculums, you can get by and teach Arabic, but a lot of those are tailored for adults as well. So for example, the Medina books would be for university students in Medina. You'll have GCSE textbooks are obviously aimed at about 15, 16-year-olds. You've got various other things, and for children, the books that you have for children are generally for Arab children or Arabic speaking or parents who are Arabic speaking and for them to teach their children and things. So again, it doesn't actually teach you Arabic. It just helps you read Arabic for those who already know Arabic. So those types of holes or gaps that we find, I think there is a huge demand to fill that gap within our own context, which is an Anglophone Muslim context, as opposed to a diaspora Arab who wants to reconnect with his culture. So I think that's not really our context. It's more theological. It's more religious primarily, and then after that. So what happens is these will give you the short-term benefits of directly relating to the Quran, directly relating it to religious lifestyle. Those types of sentences that are used today as well, and in classical Arabic as well. So something that's not exclusively modern, that won't benefit you in terms of religious context, or something that's so exclusively jahili or classical that is not used today. So I think that balance in between is something what beginners would want. And after you reach a certain level of independency or a certain level of familiarity with the language, especially in your own context, then you can branch out to other things, whether that's talking about cars and giraffes and airplanes and spaceships and things like that, cartoons and also all sorts of other things, khutbas, even the khutbas of imams, you can listen to those. And I think that even poetry, like introducing poetry, all comes at a later stage. Or nahw and sarf, that we study nahw and sarf, you wouldn't teach nahw and sarf to a 7-year-old. You just don't. Even in English, when you're studying grammar, you don't teach grammar to 7-year-olds. Apart from subliminally, you might teach it in a way that they don't really realize what you've done. So things like that, basic grammar, will have to be included anyway. But we wouldn't want a grammar-heavy curriculum. I think um, this type of curriculum is basically what's needed, and that's what Safar intends to fulfill. So we do have a book, a publication that's out already. That's for Arabic handwriting. So for those who want to learn handwriting and hand-eye coordinations and writing letters, see how they join up and how they don't join up, and having a lot of practice, we already have a publication for that, Arabic handwriting, which you can get from the Safar Publications website. But in terms of learning the language, this is still currently in development.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
please make dua for that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable it to reach fruition.
Inshallah, you guys will have success with this venture. It sounds like a very noble venture, and it's something that we need in the UK and in the US, something that's really catered towards our youth. Because even, I mean, you have a bunch of kids from diaspora. I think it's even more here in the US where diaspora kids really lose the language very early because they become so involved in American culture, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, you have to integrate into a culture eventually. But I think that would be
Yeah.
very beneficial to us here.
So I think for us as well, I think our cultures, of course, whether it's Bangladeshi or Pakistani or Somali or Turkish or something, eventually it will be watered down, and it already is watering down, which is inevitable. That's not really much of a problem. But I think the benefits of growing up bilingual is something that I don't want my kids to lose out on. So I think even if they don't like, I don't know how to read and write Bangla. Yeah, well, I can read if I struggle with it and read, but it's not something I'm proficient in. And I don't really think it's a big deal either. So if my daughter doesn't learn to read Bangla, I'm not really going to bother about it. But what I would want to bother about is her being able to read Arabic, write Arabic, so learn about handwriting. So you get a lot. It has other benefits as well. Or like when some people get into calligraphy and they're like, oh, let's paint a canvas, or let me write some Arabic things on a candle and sell it on Instagram or something. Yeah. And what happens is people try to do calligraphy when they don't know how to write. They're not familiar with handwriting yet. And to somebody who's familiar with Arabic and who's competent in reading it, including handwriting, graffitis, and calligraphy and everything else, you look at it and think, okay, this is really amateur. And the reason it's amateur, not because they don't have artistic creativity, this is commendable, definitely. What happens is, you're trying to run before you can walk. So learning handwriting first and being able to write and being able to recognize or read different handwritings, that strengthens your reading ability. And when that strengthens your reading ability, and if you could learn calligraphy, then you'll be able to write in a calligraphic way if you have the artistic creativity. The only I know this isn't a direct comparison, but the analogy I generally give is about graffiti in English. So sometimes you find really beautiful calligraphy on the walls in certain cities in England, and I'm sure you find it in America as well, or the States as you call it. Um, so what happens is, if you look at it, there is a beautiful art there. And if somebody doesn't know how to write English, just imagine if somebody grows up in a different part of the world and they learn English by speaking and listening or on YouTube and everything else and typing. They're familiar with typing, but you don't know how to write or you've not done handwriting. And then if you try to graffiti on a wall, somebody would think, oh, what on earth is going on here? Because you're not familiar with this, with the styles, the shapes, the sizes, the positioning of letters, what should go higher, what should go lower, where the middle bit is, all these types of things. It's a bit inappropriate. So if somebody wants to jump into calligraphy, I think you should learn to write first. So I'm not trying to discourage anyone from going into calligraphy. I'm
Sure.
encouraging them to write and then go into calligraphy. So please
Gotcha.
go into calligraphy, but just do it properly.
Walk before you run, in other words, like you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
So there's been research that's kind of been happening since the 70s about language acquisition that has to do more with approaches that are heavier on input rather than going with a grammar translation or grammar focused approach. What are your thoughts on these? Have you done any kind of research into them? What's your initial thoughts on them?
So I think in the immersion, of course, is crucial. I don't think anybody in the right mind would deny the the importance of immersion and input, of course. But at the same time, I think, like we said, just like you don't want to run before you can walk. You don't want to jump into the deep end of a swimming pool when you haven't been trained into swimming either. So a lot of people tend to assume like, oh, this is how children learn. So if children can learn a language like that, then why can't we adults do it the same way? Well, there's actually a couple of mistakes here because one thing is, educationally speaking, psychology or education is developmental, just like biology is developmental. So the way children learn and behave is not the same way that adults learn and behave. So and that's just something that's not, this position or this theory hasn't been refuted to this day. So I think that that's a one big fallacy as well. But another problem is that we don't tend to realize how much input children have before they start speaking a language. So if they're immersed in a language and they don't speak anything at all, they don't speak a word of it, they have hours and hours and hours of input, and then they start saying one word or one syllable words, two syllable words, or before they can even say anything, they do hand gestures. So like if I say to my daughter, head, and then she'll do this. If I say nose, and she'll do this. So she might not be able to say it properly. Or now that it happens in stages. There's a time comes where you can passively understand something, but you can't actively produce it. And then comes a stage where you can produce things in little quality and then in little quantities, and then you build and build and build on that. So I think the fact that a child has around 3 years of full-time, immersion, full-time input before they begin to speak any meaningful, coherent sentences, is that really what we're going to do if we're going to imitate the child's approach? And because sometimes people think, oh, let's just go to Egypt for a year and we'll learn Arabic that way. You can, but what would happen is the first few months you're going to waste a lot of time because you can't filter you can't process what you're immersing yourself to. So what I would suggest is if you're learning as an adult, then your time for picking up a language has gone. Yeah, as in your time for naturally picking up a language has gone now. Yeah, now you have to actively learn a language, which is different. So if somebody can learn the basics, the foundations, the tools of grammar and the basic vocabulary that are used every day, that will give them the tools to filter something with. Then if you go to Egypt, and then if you start watching videos, then you start looking at cartoons and start reading books and looking at magazines and everything else, then yes, do that as much as you can. But at least now you have tools by which to process things, by which to filter things. Then you can actually take benefit from the immersion. Otherwise, you'll have an immersive experience, and it's just like being in a foreign land where no one's teaching you anything. So I think teaching or learning grammatical rules are is more important than people tend to make out. But of
Sure.
course, that doesn't mean you're relying only on rules and never applying that into practice. The theory and the practice should go hand in hand. So learn what you learn, but then use that knowledge as a tool to benefit from your immersion. And the more you learn, the more you'll apply. And once you've gained a certain level of independence, you learn more and more sayings and more techniques and styles through the advanced immersion that we have.
Sure.
That's the same with reading. That's the same with listening. Like even in English, which we're native in reading and speaking, writing and listening English. But even now, we'll find a new saying or a new idiom that we haven't heard before. Or when we're reading like academic literature, for example, there's a certain way to phrase things that we might not have been familiar with 5 years ago. Yeah, or you learn a new way to an expression or a more particular, more specific vocabulary. Language learning is a lifelong learning. It's not something that's going to stop all. So immersion is crucial, but you can only benefit from the immersion once you have tools to benefit from. So I think the theory and practice should go hand in hand. I don't agree with either or. So having too heavy grammar without any exposure, you just have it's like have a lot of philosophy but you don't have any science. and
Yeah.
and if you have too much empirical evidence on the immersive side but you don't have any theory to back it up with, then you have data that you can't comprehend, or you can't, like, you might be able to memorize sentences like ismi Shahin, or adhab ila al-masjid or something, or what do you call it? I don't know. كتبت رسالة على iPad or something. Yeah, you might memorize sentences like that, but if somebody says the exact same sentence with different words, or same structure with different words, can you understand that? If you can't, then it's a bit of a problem. Or what if somebody changes the words around? Do you understand that? Does it change the meaning, or does it keep the same meaning but it's in a different way? You might have to guess that. If you don't have rules, you're going to guess that. So if you're a child, you have to figure these things out. And children are smart; they're very, very intelligent. You have to figure these things out. So they they subconsciously absorb the grammar. But adults need a more explicit exposure to grammar, I think. So I think we need the grammar, and that will help you watch a cartoon more effectively, or it'll help you read a book more. Or you don't need to read a book, whether it's an article or whether it's. What I would recommend is start off with those books that you don't need to read cover to cover. You read like paragraphs at a time, like miscellaneous topics that are in one book, those types of things. So short articles here and there, or tweets if somebody's got like an Arabic Twitter account. uh, I suggest that to yourself as well. Make a separate Arabic Twitter account. Just follow only Arabic things there. So you have very short, bite-sized input that you're just absorbing all the time. But I think is through knowing the rules and having some kind of guidelines that we can benefit from the immersion.
Yeah, I think I'm in a similar boat to you and my thoughts on that. Personally, I follow a very high input-driven approach because my priorities with learning classical and standard Arabic are more in listening and reading and not so much producing. I don't have really any reason to speak or write classical or modern standard Arabic for any reason. But I think taking a hybrid approach, which would be some grammar study, some language, some vocabulary study that you mean to do along with input or immersion really helps the process out. And I think some people think they have to spend a year doing this grammar and vocabulary study before they really jump in. But I mean, you can start from day one as long as they complement each other.
Yeah. So even like when, from day one, let's say you're learning the very most basic sentence, like mubtada and khabar or something. So like, the cat is, big or something. Yeah. Simple sentences like that. Now, once you learn vocabulary and then you try to make more sentences like that, and then when you open up a very simple babies or children's Arabic book, and then you have the immersion there, because your immersion is going to be in different ways. Sometimes you can interact with people and get immersion that way, but that's not feasible for everybody. You've got reading as well. So if you just have a book and just have a book on your desk and just reading these things all the time, every day or every other day, then that is the immersion. And in terms of in the Darul Uloom context, your biggest immersion is reading, because that's what you're doing. You're studying books there. You're studying literature there. You're studying legal literature. You're studying hadith literature. You're studying aqidah. You're studying all sorts of things. And there's a library there, and that's literally what you do. You end up gaining. Sorry, you end up gaining such a proficiency in Arabic that I believe you can reach a near native standard in reading. Writing obviously will require a lot more work. Listening and speaking will require a lot more work. And speaking, obviously, I think you need friends or you need interactions. Otherwise, it just can't happen. And within the students, sometimes you try to create this environment of speaking, but then people just don't really bother with it at the end. But I think in terms of reading, in a Darul Uloom setting, that's what it's all about. It's all about reading, and a lot of these books, kind of things, are part of the curriculum. So like these are the books of hadith and things I've got here. It's like Bukhari and Muslim and things. So you have to study those within it's part of your curriculum. So I think during those years, you're not studying Arabic anymore. You're just studying things in Arabic. So now, even after graduating, there's tons of things we just have. Just you'll read Arabic. You'll be on WhatsApp groups in Arabic. You'll follow Twitter in Arabic. You'll watch videos in Arabic. You might listen to podcasts and things like sometimes when I'm driving, if I'm going to London or somewhere, I'll just put on some durus in the car, or listen to somebody's PhD wife in the car, listen to somebody's lecture in the car, and that's it. I'll just drive, going for an hour and a half to London, and there's listening immersion going on. So I think those kind of things you're going to have to try to do whatever you can. But grammar, you don't need to study grammar for the rest of your life. Grammar, you only need to spend like 2-3 years on it, but not independently of practice. Sure. While you're doing those 3 years, study, get as much immersion as you can in terms of reading, listening, and speaking. And listening, I would include watching in there as well, because body language and tones and things, you get a lot more through watching. And we have this now. We didn't have this like 15, 20 years ago. You probably didn't have all of that. So if we have that, I would recommend those who are, of course, believe in the permissibility of videography, definitely take advantage of that. But yeah, I think after you learn your grammar and things, there's only a certain amount of grammar you're gonna go through. After that, it's just everything will be immersion,
Hmm.
unless you have a particular question on a very advanced thing. You're like, hold on a minute, what's going on here? Then you might check up a dictionary. Then you might check up a reference text in Nahu or something. But yes, I think 3 years of Nahu is more than enough.
Hmm. Yeah, at that point you have the basics and the most important parts of the
To be honest,
language down.
I think you could get the basics in 2 years. I
Hmm.
think in 2 years you could get the more a confident amount, especially for most normal people. I think
Hmm.
2 years of grammar is more than enough. And if you want to be a bit more advanced in it, then yeah, 3 years is enough. Beyond that, it's for specialists.
Hmm. Yeah,
Beyond that, if
that makes
yeah,
sense. I remember when you were talking with Sam. You mentioned a professor of English. His name was Dr. Abdullah Ad-Danan, who has this methodology. I guess the way you would translate it is intuition and practice,
mm.
um, where he
الفطرة
just
والممارسة. Yeah.
yeah. I'm not sure exactly. I guess maybe fitra you could say intuition or maybe a natural way of learning.
Natural, I think natural, yeah. I
Uh,
think what that means is gaining an immersive experience from
mhm,
your infancy.
mhm.
Yeah.
And I think we both agree that that's a very effective way to get people talking. And I think when you were talking about, you mentioned someone who said we could have Arabic being the second language of Muslims worldwide in 40 years. That
Yeah.
this kind of tactic or methodology is would be extremely beneficial in achieving that and making it almost effortless. Because once you have someone who has an almost native grasp of a language, it's a lot easier to engage with the language. Even if
Absolutely,
you want to
absolutely.
study Nahw and Sarf, once you know Arabic, it's very intuitive, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So, like, if you watch Dr. Abdullah Dannan's videos, in some of his lectures, he actually shows videos of, from the 80s when he was teaching his when he was speaking to his children in Arabic, and even normal basic things like he'll have a basketball net, and he's got a 2 3 year old child with him, and he says, "I'll throw the ball in there once, and then you throw the ball in there once." So he'll say something like, أنا أرميها مرة وأنت ترميها مرة. So these, it's such a normal situation that he speaks
Hmm.
in clean Fusha.
Hmm.
And so to the point that his wife would speak Ammiya or Lahja, and he would speak Fusha. So when these children speak to their grandparents and when they speak to the father, they can code switch instantly.
Hmm.
And I think the reason why Arabs would have found that really, wow, this is so amazing, is because they grew up as monolinguals.
Hmm.
But I think for those of us who had the privilege to grow up bilingual, we had to code switch every day of our lives. So
Hmm.
like in the house, we weren't allowed to speak English at home, which I'm very thankful to my parents for actually. Yeah.
Hmm.
Even there's pros and cons to that, which we can discuss another time perhaps. But we spoke only Bangla in the house and and English in school and English elsewhere, English on the TV and everything else. But with family, it was always Bangla. So if it's something like the neighbor's here to do something, or let's say the postman is here, and or I don't know, somebody's here, they say something in English, then I'll go back and or let's say somebody's on the phone and say, "Can we speak to your parents about such and such and such a thing?" Then immediately you'll code switch and speak to your parents in a different language, and then you'll
Hmm.
come back to the phone and speak differently again. So I think because we're used to that,
Hmm.
I found it less harder to believe, of course, that Dr. Abdullah Dannan can successfully do this because we grew up as 3 year olds. We have a passive understanding of both languages. I remember when I was about 3 or 4 years old, even though I wasn't speaking English yet because I hadn't gone to school yet,
Hmm.
I, as in, well, there's only so many words you can say when you're 3 or 4 years old. Yeah, so I can speak Bangla, but then in terms of English, I can understand everything that was going on around me. You
Sure.
just we just weren't speaking it because there's no one speaking it. And once you go to school, let's say everybody's speaking English. So I think having that, I can actually you know put myself into the child's shoes. So Abdullah Dannan's child shoes. And
Hmm.
okay, I realize that because it gives me memories of my past. But then I think it works. Like if a lot of Arabs tend to think, oh, you can't learn Fusha natively anymore. You can't just speak Arabic and learn Fusha anymore. You'll have
Hmm.
to learn the grammar and then learn Arabic. And it's a very intellectual process.
Hmm.
Whereas Abdullah Dannan has empirically shown us that no, the same way that the ancient Arabs learned Arabic, you can still do the same thing, because these rules, these grammatical rules, the children will absorb that naturally. They will absorb that and pick it up in a way, without even knowing that they're learning grammar rules. And one my employer actually does this. So Safar Publications is headed by Sheikh Hassan Ali of London. So he's a very famous speaker. A lot of people would know of him. So he's Bangladeshi himself, and he speaks to his children in Arabic. I've been to his house and listened to him speak Arabic to his children and things. And Fusha, of course, he doesn't speak Lecture. You're gonna find a British Bangladeshi speaking to them in a Masri or something. But, so he speaks to them on Fusha, and they understand what's going on, and they can reply back as well. And he actually told me once that sometimes what happens is you speak to your children and you make a mistake in Arabic. You make a mistake, yeah. Like, for example, he said, I think they were at a train station once with his wife and children, and he said something like, القطار تأتي. And then they were like, Baba, القطار يأتي. يأتي القطار, yeah. But they hadn't studied grammar. But
Yeah.
they knew intuitively that ta'ti is feminine, or well, we would explain it as ta'ti is feminine, qatar, or the train, is masculine. So it's ya'ti al-qatar, it's not ta'ti al-qatar. But then the fact that they intuitively picked that up, Sheikh Hassan Ali was really surprised and pleased with that. And so when you told me, I found that really interesting as well. So it shows that British Bangladeshis in England can pull it off. And obviously his children are in the teens now. Yeah, and I've spoken to some of them, and they actually know what's going on. As in, I've spoken to them in Arabic to figure out, let me see what kind of level their understanding is at. And mashallah, it's really impressive. And this is before social media. This is before YouTube. This is before all of that. So if he managed to pull it off without without the resources that we have today, then I think in theory we should have even more success at raising our own children speaking Arabic. So I think he's actually an inspiration. I take him as a personal inspiration that despite not being a native speaker of the language, and at the beginning he had to struggle with it, because of course you have to force yourself to speak it, and then
have to learn various strange vocabulary words for things that you wouldn't think of before in the house.
And then soon enough, it just becomes natural. Now he can speak Arabic really comfortably now. So like even with myself, with my daughter and things, if I obviously mainly it's just English and Bangla in the house, which is how it happens. But I try to force myself to speak some Arabic with her as well, and I have to pick up some vocabulary as well. Like nappy. How do you say a nappy in Arabic? Because you're not gonna find that in a book on usul al-fiqh or something. Yeah,
exactly.
you're not gonna find that in Jahili poetry, because they probably didn't have nappies back then. So I would have to ask my Arab friends, like, what do you guys say? So it's hafada. So you say hafada muttasikha for a dirty nappy, or something. Some say wasikha. Some say muttasikha. Muttasikha is a bit better for other reasons. So some of my friends who either grew up speaking Arabic or they are native Arabs themselves, I go to them for it, and instead of looking at a dictionary or something, because you just see what's the expression in a more native way. Or like bubbles, blowing bubbles. I'll speak to an Arab friend and say, how do you say bubbles in Arabic? How do you say shall I blow bubbles? And then you learn this faqa'at. So faqa'a is a bubble, and faqa'at is bubbles. So you start blowing, hal anfukh faqa'at, and then you start blowing bubbles. And then you realize as well, hold on a minute, that word actually comes in the Quran, because faqi'u lawnuha tasurru an-nadirin. So the yellow calf, not the yellow calf, the yellow cow that the Banu Israel had to slaughter at the time of Musa alayhi salam, its color was striking. Or what we'd really say, faqa'a means to pop, and faqa'a is something that pops. So it explodes. So you have a bubble and that it basically pops. So faqi'u lawnuha means its color was popping, it was bursting. So yeah, to burst basically. So its color was bursting, and it was aesthetically pleasing to the onlookers. So I think learning modern Arabic does actually help us in understanding classical things. This is why I don't like the dichotomy of modern Arabic and classical Arabic, because it's the same word, or it's the same root at least. So it's completely the same word. I think those types of things are helpful, because when I'm trying to do day-to-day things, so my Arabic is obviously largely Shara'i, and I am quite comfortable, alhamdulillah, with modern Arabic, normal Arabic as well, but not so much for day-to-day household things. like mattress and bed and or bed we know obviously everyone knows that, but
Washer and dryer and
yeah, yes. So, like who knows how to say half of these things? So you just have to learn on the go. And this is why language learning is just it's a lifelong journey.
Mhm. I definitely agree. So you personally don't see that this methodology that Dr. Adnan uses is the end all be all for adults. You see that just as something when someone is in the first years of their life. Is that correct?
Dr. Abdullah Dannan,
Correct.
the
His idea that we can pick up Arabic in a more intuitive
oh no,
fashion.
yeah, so that's for children. So his
Hmm.
project is for children,
Hmm.
and he actually has a short publication on it. It might have been his speech that's transcribed or something, but there's a YouTube lecture on the whole method. تعليم اللغة العربية بالفطرة والممارسة, something like that. Or probably تعليم الأطفال or something. Anyway, so there's a publication that's available as a PDF, and what they do is they send their teachers, like primary school teachers, to a center, to a markaz, where they train them to speak Fusha clearly. Because all educated Arabs would know Fusha. They have to.
Hmm.
But being able to speak Fusha correctly without making mistakes is a different issue. So
Hmm.
what they do is they train them to be able to speak and to go through the whole process of making your mistakes and fixing them and having a cleaner Arabic speech. So once the teachers do that, the generally female, the ladies, they come back to their kindergarten, Rawdatul Atfal. So they have Rawdatul Atfal and teach them Arabic there. So in class and outside of class, the whole kindergarten, the whole school, everything is in Arabic, even if it's not academically related.
Hmm.
So if it's something in the playground or something about fetching water, whatever, everything is in Fusha Arabic, and they speak correctly with the correct grammar, with the correct vocabulary, without obviously you might make some mistakes here and there, but it's not like a consistent mistake where the children will pick it up wrongly.
Hmm.
So, and that Roda is very successful. I can't remember which countries they did it. I read it a couple of years back, but it absolutely works. But I don't think you can do that with adults purely because we've missed that age. So we have to, you can try it all you want, but I think if somebody's an Arabic teacher who can speak Arabic really well, then after learning, after the students gain a certain level of independence, the teacher should just start teaching in Arabic. So
Yeah.
one of our teachers, he teaches only in Arabic for advanced students. He teaches only in Arabic and he speaks to them in Arabic. Phone calls in Arabic, text messages in Arabic, everything is in Arabic. Uh, it's only for beginners that he teaches in English and or he mixes Arabic and English. But for advanced students, he just speaks strictly Arabic. I think that's the better way to do it because that's after that it's just immersion, isn't it? So for children, they'll just natively pick it up. For adults, is having input. So
Hmm.
it's just the receptivity is not the same, even if the output you could say is the same.
Yeah, I find that the receptive skills like listening and reading, it's very easy. I mean, it's comparatively easier to get up to a native level of listening and speak and
Yeah.
reading, whereas I think really the issues come in outputting and
Mm.
writing and speaking, where you'll just make pronunciation errors when you know exactly how to say the word. Maybe some of that is confidence. Maybe some of that is, actually, I mean, it very well may be something neurological that has stopped working so
Yeah.
well for us that requires just more practice.
I think that will always be the case in every
Hmm.
language and in every skill, even. So your passive comprehension of something will always be more than your active ability. So, for example, even in English, you can get a normal, native Englishman, and they might be able to access, deep, dense academic literature.
Hmm.
They might be asking if they try, they'll understand it. But can they speak in academic English? No, like a lot of people won't. You'll have to be some kind of a professor to do that.
Hmm.
Normal people, like like news, when you listen to news on the TV, everybody understands the news,
Hmm.
but nobody speaks like that. Not even if you try to, you probably can't unless you've practiced a lot in your free time. Yeah.
Correct.
So because it's not just the style and the tone that's different, but
Hmm.
the type of vocabulary they use is quite different as well. And nobody speaks like that naturally. So I think um, Yeah, your passive understanding of it will be one thing. So like passively understanding the news is one thing, but actively producing the news or speaking like a newscaster, I think that requires a bit more practice because it's not what you're wanting to do really.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's something that as an adult requires a ton of practice, whereas children, it's like even with very little input, they'll begin outputting, albeit incorrectly at first, they'll fix
Mm,
their own errors
yeah.
and start developing more complicated speech.
And I think that that's a lesson we can take from children actually. Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Mhm.
Because sometimes we adults have a bit too much pride and well, people will laugh at me if I make a mistake, but
Mhm.
really they won't because only someone who's really arrogant and conceitful will laugh at you for making a mistake. Yeah, if somebody knows you're a beginner student of Arabic
Mhm.
and you're eager to learn the language, they will be happy that even if you make a mistake, they'll be happy, wow, this person is actually learning Arabic. So
Mhm.
I remember when I used to speak to, if I find somebody speaking, somebody's an Arabic speaker, I'll find them in the masjid, walk home with them, whatever. I will speak to them, and it doesn't matter. If I make a mistake, they wouldn't say anything, or if it's something that they can, it's a teachable moment, then they'll tell me how to properly say that, and I'll learn from that. So, but I think sometimes, yeah, when you become an adult, then you have a bit more of a reputation to, that you can't jeopardize. But when you're still a student, you could say, "Oh, I'm still a student. I'm still learning." But the reality is, look, if you're going to look at it from an Islamic perspective, you should be a talib ilm. You should be a student from the cradle to the grave. This is what the ulama say, don't they? "اطلب العلم من المهد إلى اللحد." Learn, be somebody who actively seeks knowledge, searches for knowledge from the cradle until the grave. So your whole lifelong journey should be one of learning, not one of I've made it and I'm just going to stay stagnant for the rest of my life. I don't think that's what Allah wants from us.
Yeah, and I think we should also test our arrogance by humbling ourselves in as many situations as we can. And one of those would be speaking foreign languages, definitely.
Yeah,
It's good for the ego to be put down a little bit from time to time.
we realize our own imperfections that way.
Hmm.
But at
So,
the same time, there's nothing wrong with being imperfect
mhm.
because all of us will be imperfect. If you're not God, you're imperfect, and you just leave it there.
And just realize that more often than you don't, and you'd be in good shape.
Yeah.
My last question for you before we go on to some user or some people who are on Twitter want to ask some questions for you, or what advice do you give for someone who's gone through a program like the 10 lessons, who's maybe done العربية بين يديك or a Kitab series, and they've got like a grasp of the grammar and some decent vocabulary. What's the next steps for them? What do you recommend that they do by themselves?
Okay, so I'm just going to rephrase the question then just to make it a bit more clearer. I'm assuming
Sure.
you're saying those who have reached a certain level of independence
Yeah, they
can now go on and self-study.
exactly. Maybe they
That
self-studied
level?
the basics, or they've taken classes with the basics. They know the different tenses,
Yeah.
when and they know basic nahu and sarf. What do
Okay,
they
so
do next?
now it's read, read, and read.
Hmm.
Read and watch videos as much as you can, or listen to podcasts, listen to durus, listen to the khutbah of the Haramain. Just immerse yourself in whichever way is possible. If you can, if your work situation, your life, family situation, your financial situation allows you to go abroad, then go for it. Or what's equally beneficial, I think, is if you can find Arab teachers in your own countries, then it's the same thing because going to Egypt or going somewhere else where you might actually pick up more Musli than Arabic,
Hmm.
yeah, and if you find a teacher in England or teachers in England or sorry in the States as well or whichever respective countries our viewers are from, then you have the same immersive experience, but it's more in your context. So just like how I had to learn Urdu, yeah, I could have gone to Pakistan and learned Urdu, which would be impractical because it just doesn't make sense for me to go there. But
Hmm.
when I went to Darul Uloom, we had to learn it for the sake of because everything was that's the language medium was the lingua franca of the Darul Uloom. That's just how it was. Things are changing now, but that's how it was in 2008 anyway. So we had to learn that, and it was all immersive. And some of our teachers were British, and some of our teachers were from India. So the teachers who are from India, they had a stronger grasp of Urdu and less of a grasp of English. So
Hmm.
their Urdu is so strong, and if you just listen to them for hours on end, or like 45-minute lessons, 1 hour lessons, and then you're communicating with them outside of class, and they're giving lectures in the evenings and reminders and what have you. That is just as much of an immersive experience as you're going to get if you go to Pakistan or somewhere. Apart from you're not going to learn any swear words, you're not going to learn any street dialect and things. But in terms of real meaningful communication, it's really strong. So when I came back, I have some Pakistani relatives, and I actually didn't know that they were Pakistani at one point until it started speaking Urdu, and then they were shocked that I can speak Urdu to the point that from their perspective, it sounds really academic, and it's the educated people of Pakistan who speak like that. Whereas
Hmm.
for me, it's just that's the only Urdu I know. So I don't know, the Urdu that's probably spoken on TV shows or something, because I haven't had that experience. I've only had scholarly experience, and this is the language. This is how they communicate with each other. This is how they communicate with us, and this is the kind of background we're from. So then naturally, the kind of language I speak will be a lot more formal. So I think, yeah, you can have an immersive experience within your own countries as well if you can find native Arabic teachers. And you have a lot of Arabs who have migrated into these countries as well. And if you can find them, then I think that's even better to some degree. That's not to say it's not beneficial to go abroad. Of course, you'll
Hmm.
still learn a lot more from the culture, a lot more from different situations, like different. It's just a very different exposure altogether.
No, you're right. I think there's different, I don't know if they're called linguistic fields when you talk about, lexical groupings. Like there's just certain vocabulary that you'll learn at a supermarket that you won't learn if you're just talking to someone one to
Yeah.
one every day.
Mhm.
But like, for example, in Arabic and Lebanese Arabic, I couldn't tell you anything about a car.
Yeah.
Because I've never talked to anyone or learned anything about cars in Lebanese Arabic, but and many other
Mm-hmm.
fields like the education, Islam, and household things, relationships. I'm perfectly fine talking
Yeah.
about those things.
No, I remember as well, like when we grew up learning Bangla as well, Bengali or Sylheti dialect of Bangla. What would happen is when we go to Bangladesh or somewhere, it's quite different. In that the language is the same, but of course the in England where we might change some words for English words, in Bengali they just have in Bangladesh they just have those words. So
Hmm.
you learn different things like gaming, certain types of games, and how they play and the moves they have in the games. They'll use authentic Bengali words there, whereas in Britain we'll just substitute that for an English word, or drinks, or how their own slang would be slightly different from what we're used to over here. So I
Hmm.
think yeah, having linguistic fields or something would still be beneficial, but I don't want youngsters to feel that demotivated, that just because you can't go to Egypt, just because you can't go to Jordan, yeah,
Hmm.
because you don't have £500 to spare, you don't have so many hundreds of pounds for for your ticket and to be able to rent a house over there. If you're not in that situation, then don't think you can't do anything, because ما لا يدرك كله لا يترك كله. If you can't
Hmm.
attain something in its full, then don't abandon it in its full either. And in England, in America, you'll be able to do a lot more than people sometimes make it out.
Hmm.
You can
Definitely.
gain a strong proficiency in Arabic by living within the same country.
Okay, so that was the end of my questions, and I don't want to keep you for too much longer. So I
Actually,
guess.
I don't think I answered the question. So what can they do?
Oh,
Yeah.
I
So
thought you were saying immersion. Go ahead and immerse
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
immerse.
yeah. Okay, okay, yeah. I guess that did answer it. So yeah, read a lot and listen a lot and watch a lot, speak a lot.
Mm, very good. Let's see what we have here. So Muhammad asks, working with Quran seems to be a nice way to work through Fusha. What are documents for Ammiya or colloquial Arabic? What kind of texts exist that are not in Fusha or MSA? I'm not sure if this question really um, pertains to you. How much of a experience do you have with different dialects, or do you have interest in them?
I do have an interest in them, but that's what it is. It's just an interest. So I'm probably going to pass on that question
Okay.
because it's just not for me.
I would say, from coming from someone who learned Lebanese Arabic for the past 2 years by being in Lebanon, I think it's very difficult to learn any kind of colloquial Arabic outside of the country. Although it is possible, there are developing, many places are developing, curriculums and books for that. But as of right now, they're not amazing. So just really immersion works the best in that field. Someone says, I would like to know how he learned reading Arabic in a few minutes to a high level for sure. Not like you learned in a few minutes how to read Arabic, but I guess.
I think that was actually a joke in your regarding your tweet.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I think the way you tweeted it is we're asking Sheikh Shaheen how he learned Arabic in a few minutes, meaning we're going to speak at 5 o'clock. Whereas they must have, it would have been better if you said, I'm going to speak to Sheikh Shaheen in a few minutes about how he learned Arabic.
There we go.
So yeah, I didn't learn Arabic in a few minutes.
Okay. That's
It
my
takes years. It takes years.
adverbial phrase got a little bit of
This is why Nahu is
experience.
important, by the way. Just this is why Nahu is important.
Okay, so the last person said, advice for someone that can already read the Arabic script but doesn't know the language itself. I want to be able to navigate fiqh books and discussions. So they've got their goal and they know the alphabet. So what do they do now?
Yeah, so now you have to, this is what we said. So you have to learn grammar and immersion at the same time. And if you want to learn, access fiqh texts and things, you're going to need a teacher. You can't learn these things without a teacher. So I think learn Arabic as well, learn the grammar and things with a teacher, and have some kind of, practice with the teachers as well. And then your self-study, you should be able to just read a lot of books. I really like, GCSE Arabic. I really benefited from that, even though it's something that a lot of people just dismiss because, you're not going to get examined on it, or the exam doesn't really matter that much. You do get examined on it, but it doesn't really matter. But I think it benefited me a lot as well. So when we were studying fiqh texts, al-Quduri, Mukhtasar al-Quduri, which is a Hanafi primer, a very early Hanafi primer, I remember we were doing, during that same year, we were doing GCSE Arabic, and people wouldn't bother in it, but I would write down these new vocabulary. I would learn these new vocabs, like watching is, shahada. Shahada yushahidu mushahadatan. Mushahadatu tilfaz, for example, means watching. Yeah. So I would learn something like this because I think it's beneficial. Others would just, ignore it. But then, like, within a few days, in Quduri, we had the exact same word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And nobody really knew it because they didn't learn it in GCSE Arabic, or they just didn't realize it's there. But I knew that purely because we did it in a modern context. All you got to do there is apply in that context, because it still means to observe. It still means to look at something. So if you're going to do like moon sighting or something, you'll still say mushahada. Because it's still the same word in a different capacity. So I think because this is why I don't like splitting modern Arabic and classical Arabic, because it's the same language in a different setting. That's it. So if you're going to speak Arabic or let's say English as well. Let's say you say the word operation. Yeah. You can go into a hospital and that means something different, or it means one thing. You can go to a police station and operation means something else completely. Yeah. Whereas the word is the same and our era is the same. It's just a terminology difference depending on the context. And that just applies everywhere. I think it applies in Arabic, it applies in Bengali, it applies in like resort. You could say, I'll only do that as a last resort. That's one way of saying it. Or you could say, I'm going to Turkey as a holiday resort. Or this is, I'm not going to this country. It's not very much of a holiday resort. So what does that mean? It's not the same thing anymore. It's just not. So like, even though the word, if you're going to break the word down, then yeah, it will be the same thing. But contextually, it's just completely different. So I think learning, contemporary usage of Arabic is very, very helpful, even if it's for engaging with fiqh texts or aqidah texts or hadith or history or something like that, or the Quran or Sunnah, which is more important, of course. But I think in terms of reading, there's quite a lot of things you can. I would just say just read anything and everything you can get your hands on. Whether that's if you're in the Darul Uloom context, just go to the library and just pick up anything. If there's a bookshop, one of the first book I ever bought in my life, the first Arabic book I bought outside of my curriculum text, was the book Al-Fawaid by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah rahimahullah. It means benefits. So it's just different things on akhlaq and character and zuhud and other things. Just a half a page on a topic, and that's it. Then you could just scroll and go somewhere else. Another half a page on something else. or maybe one page, maybe 2 pages, and you don't need to read it cover to cover. So it just gives you short, bite-sized. It's the equivalent of having scrolling through somebody's Facebook post or Facebook
Sure.
feed, yeah, or the equivalent of going through somebody's Twitter, yeah. So that was what I was doing then. I think GCSE Arabic is really good. I think Kamil Kailani's books are really good. Of course, he has very different levels as well. So younger children, and he'll have like older children, and he'll write for various audiences. I think I generally don't advise translations. I generally don't advise translations. However, I have found that well, this is just my opinion. It's not. I think the translations of Harry Potter is actually quite decent. Yeah, not that it's so literary and is model prose in Arabic or anything, but it's really good for light reading. And it's obviously a non-religious context and things, and you have like meals, you have conversations, you have very friendship and things like that. But the Arabic is nice. It's actually much better than normal translations I've seen. The translations tend to be poor. You could just tell it doesn't follow the flow of Arabic.
Sure.
Whereas what I've read from Harry Potter is something I would actually recommend youngsters to look at. Once you're a bit more advanced, you could look at Kalila wa Dimna, which is ancient. It's about 1200 years old. We had to study that for A2 level Arabic. So in our fourth year, I believe it was our fourth year of the Darul Uloom, we had to do it there. That's brilliant. That's a timeless text. And that's a model of Arabic prose as well. I think poetry as well. Like, if you want to read poetry, ideally you'd want to start off with a teacher. But then if you're not, if you don't have that, you could just buy anyone's diwan or any compilation of Arabic. You even have some compilations like Sheikh Fariduddin Mas'ud from Bangladesh. He's actually got a book called Rawa'i' min Ash'ari Sahaba radiyallahu anhum. So Rawa'i' min Ash'ari Sahaba means the excellent poems from that were written by the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's published by Dar al-Hadith in Egypt. So they have the poetry there. He explains some of the wordings, some of the vocabulary in Arabic. So it's really good. And if you can't access anyone's books, there are plenty of apps now as well that you can just download on your iPad or on your phone or something. Like Diwan al-Arab is a really good app. Let me just show you actually. So this is it, Diwan al-Arab. I've got a thing here. You could just click on Shu'ara or something, click on your favorite poem. I'll go on like Suhair ibn Abi Sulma, and they got so many poems there. So
MashaAllah.
the Bahr is there. You can search for anybody. You can go look. This is the list of sorry, let me just hold it a bit more properly. This is a list of poets, yeah, and it's just, if you could just scroll, there's so many, there's thousands of them throughout the eras. It's a free app. You don't need to pay for anything, and you could just go on. You could just choose your favorite poems and things. You've got like the mu'allaqat here. Everything is in here, and you can copy and paste as well.
Wow, that's a good feature as well, to be able to copy and paste.
Yeah, and you could search something as well. If you heard a poem somewhere and you think, whoa, you know what, I need to read this up, you could just go on this one, search it, and see if they have it within the database. They've got about, I don't know, 47,000 poems or something. So just imagine you got all of that for free, and you can spend tens of pounds, or you can spend hundreds of pounds if you want to go into poetry. If you really want to. Not that you should, but downloading apps like this, I think it just helps. Like, why not use these facilities, especially if it's not illegal or anything, because they themselves put an app store for free.
Very nice.
So I
I
think-
really that's a really good answer, and I'll have to check out that app for sure. I want to tell you, thank you so much for coming on with me and having this conversation. I think I've learned a lot from you, and I think I've got a few tips that I can implement myself as well. It's a pleasure finally speaking to you for the first time, even though we've had some back and forths over DM and replies on Twitter. So
Barakallah feek. It's been a pleasure to come here. It's always beneficial to come on a podcast for the sake of benefiting others. I think having a mutual conversation where I can learn myself and others can perhaps engage with my thoughts, it's always something beneficial. So
All right.
jazakallah khair for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
And you as well. And I'll make sure that I put your Twitter handle and links to some of your books that I think would be pretty helpful for learners in the description box, so people can reach out to you and benefit from your works. Um, all right, so I'm going to end the podcast here. Thank you so much for watching that interview with Shahin-ur Rahman. I hope you learned a lot. And like I said, if you'd like to reach out to him, questions about Arabic or Islam or anything like that, his Twitter handle will be below. I'll also link some books that I think learners of Arabic might find useful, that have been published by Safar, the company that Shahin-ur Rahman has worked with, and also some other ones that I think are beneficial that I've used personally in my own self-study. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment about what other kinds of podcasts you'd like to see or videos in general. All right, thank you. Bye.